this is how the story ends, not with the sound of a shot or a final word spoken into the vast, indifferent emptiness of the territory, but with the quiet discovery of a life meticulously unmade and then remade in secret. Sheriff Tate stood in the mouth of the rock shelter, the cool, subterranean air breathing out over him, a stark contrast to the September heat that baked the granite slopes of the Blackstone Range. A full year since Abram Hale, a man of 50 whose face had been carved into a mask of stoicism by sun and sorrow, had walked away from the desiccated remains of his ranch and vanished from the world of men. They had searched, of course, in the perfunctory way that men searched for someone who seemed to want to be lost. They rode the boundaries, called his name into canyons that swallowed the sound, and eventually, they gave up, concluding he had succumbed to the elements or simply kept walking until he had walked off their map entirely. But his horse had been found, unsaddled and grazing peacefully by a creek a month later, and that small detail had always bothered Tate. It was an act of care, not of desperation. Now, standing here, he understood. Before him, set back into the deep recess of the cavern, was not a crude lean-to but a small, perfect cabin, its walls fashioned from pine logs hewn with an almost reverent precision. The joints were tight, chinked with a mixture of dried moss and clay that rendered them impervious to the wind. A stone chimney, built with the skill of a master mason, rose against the rock wall. It was a home, not a hideout. A place built to last. Deputy Finn, younger and still capable of simple wonder, stepped past him. "My God," Finn whispered, his voice absorbed by the silence of the place. "He built all this." By himself. The interior was a testament to a singular, focused will. Firewood was stacked neatly to the ceiling along one wall, enough for 2 hard winters. On shelves carved directly into the rock, dried herbs and roots were arranged in careful bundles. Strips of jerky, dark and hard as wood, hung from the rafters. A bed frame, built into the corner, was covered with a patchwork of tanned deer and rabbit hides, stitched together with practiced hands. There was no chaos here, no sign of a mind succumbing to loneliness. There was only order, a quiet, defiant rhythm of existence. Tate ran a hand over the smooth, worn surface of a small table. "A man does not build a place like this to die. He builds it to live." The thought settled in his gut, heavy and cold. He had known Abram, not well, but as well as anyone knew a man who spoke only when necessary. He had seen the slow strangulation of his ranch, the encroachment of Sterling's vast cattle empire, the polite, legal paperwork that was as effective as a drawn pistol. Tate had done nothing. He had stamped the papers, offered his condolences, and watched another good man get ground into dust by the turning of a wheel he couldn't stop. He had assumed Abram broke. Looking at this place, this fortress of solitude and purpose, he realized he had been wrong. Abram hadn't broken. He had simply stepped aside, refusing to play the game any longer. He had chosen a different board, with different rules. It had started with the water, or the lack of it. For 2 summers, the creek that fed Abram's land had dwindled from a steady pulse to a weak, thready vein, and then to nothing but a scar of cracked mud. The earth itself grew hard and unforgiving, the grass turning from pale green to the color of old bone. His cattle, once thick-limbed and sturdy, grew gaunt, their ribs a stark pattern beneath their hides. He watched them die, one by one, not with the sharp finality of a predator's attack, but with the slow, grinding cruelty of thirst. He hauled water from the deep well near the house, a back-breaking, spirit-crushing task that yielded just enough to keep his last few head, and himself, alive. Each morning, he would stand on his porch and look east, toward the sprawling, verdant lands of the Sterling Consolidated Cattle Company. Sterling had bought the upstream rights years ago, a move that seemed insignificant at the time. Now, it was a slow death sentence. Sterling's dams held the water, hoarding it for his thousands of head, leaving only a trickle for the men downstream. It was legal. It was progress. It was, for Abram, the end of a world. His wife, gone 5 years now from a fever that burned through her in a week, had loved this land. She had seen life in its stubborn soil, beauty in its harsh horizons. Her memory was staked into the ground with every fence post he had driven, every stone he had cleared. Losing the land felt like losing her all over again, a second, deeper burial. he stopped talking to his neighbors, not out of anger, but because their pity felt like stones thrown at a drowning man. They saw a failure. A man beaten by the weather, by bad luck. They didn't see the calculated, deliberate pressure that was squeezing the life from him. They didn't see the letters from the bank, the polite but firm inquiries from Sterling's agents about a fair price for his holdings. A fair price for his wife's grave. A fair price for the sum of his life. One evening, a man in a clean suit rode up, his horse too fine for the dusty track. He didn't dismount. "Mr. Sterling is prepared to make a final offer, Hale," the man said, his voice devoid of any emotion. "It's more than the bank will give you when they take it." Abram looked at the man, then at the parched land stretching out behind him. He felt nothing. The anger, the grief, the desperation, it had all burned away, leaving behind a cold, clear calm. He was no longer a rancher fighting for his home. He was just a man standing on a patch of dirt that would soon belong to someone else. "The land is not for sale," Abram said, his voice flat. The man in the suit almost smiled. "It won't be your choice for much longer." He turned his fine horse and rode away, leaving a trail of dust that settled over everything, a fine grey shroud. That night, Abram did not go to bed. He sat at his kitchen table, the one he had built with his own hands, and watched the moon trace its slow path across the sky. He was not thinking about the bank, or Sterling, or the dead cattle. He was thinking about the mountains to the west, the dark, jagged line of the Blackstones. A place where deeds and titles meant nothing. A place where a man was measured only by what he could do, by the strength in his back and the resolve in his heart. The world of men, with its paper laws and its quiet cruelties, had taken everything from him. It would not take his ending. He would write that himself. The decision, when it finally solidified, was not a storm but a settling. It was the quiet click of a lock falling into place, a sound only he could hear. For weeks, he had moved through his days like a ghost, tending to the last of his affairs with a mechanical detachment. The world had become a series of tasks, devoid of meaning. But after the visit from Sterling's man, a new kind of energy began to stir within him. It was not hope, but purpose. A cold, hard certainty that gave his movements a new economy, a new weight. He rode into town the next day, a list committed to memory. The town of Redemption was little more than a single dusty street lined with false-fronted buildings, a place that clung precariously to existence, much like he had. He bypassed the saloon, the sheriff's office, the places where men gathered to talk about their diminishing fortunes. His destination was Hemlock's Mercantile, a repository of essentials that smelled of leather, coffee, and dry goods. Mr. Hemlock, a man whose face was a permanent mask of weary appraisal, watched him enter. "Abram," he said, a simple acknowledgement. "Hemlock," Abram replied. There was no need for pleasantries. He began to move through the store, selecting his items with a quiet focus that drew Hemlock's attention. Not the usual flour and salt. He took 2 heavy axes, a whetstone, a full box of iron nails of varying sizes. He bought the largest cast iron pot Hemlock had in stock, a heavy, deep-bellied thing that could cook for an army or render tallow for a dozen candles. He bought fishing line, a collection of hooks, and a thick roll of snare wire. Then he moved to the fabrics, choosing not finished clothes but bolts of heavy canvas and the thickest wool blanket. He paid in cash, from a small leather pouch that held the last of his money. It was the sum of his worldly possessions, the liquidation of his past. Hemlock counted the coins, his brow furrowed. "Long trip planned, Abram?" he asked, his curiosity finally getting the better of his professional reserve. Abram looked at the pile of goods on the counter. It was a strange collection. Not enough for a new start somewhere else, but too much for a man who was giving up. It was the equipment of a man intending to build a world from scratch. "Just getting prepared," Abram said, his voice even. The ambiguity of his words hung in the air. Prepared for what? Winter? The end of the world? Hemlock didn't press. He had been in this territory long enough to know that some questions were better left unasked. He simply nodded and helped Abram load the supplies onto his pack mule. As Abram was about to leave, Tate stepped out of his office across the street. He saw the loaded mule, saw the look on Abram's face, and a flicker of something, unease, perhaps responsibility, crossed his features. He walked over, his spurs kicking up small puffs of dust. "Everything all right, Abram?" Tate asked. It was the question of a man doing his job, not the question of a man who cared about the answer. Abram looked at the sheriff, the symbol of the law that had protected Sterling's water and validated the bank's claim. He saw not a man, but an institution. "Never been better, Sheriff," he replied. And in that moment, it was the truest thing he had ever said. He was leaving behind the world that had broken him, and he was doing it on his own 2 feet. He turned his horse and mule west, toward the mountains, and did not look back. The town of Redemption, with its tired laws and its weary men, receded behind him, becoming just another memory he was choosing to leave behind. The finality of his departure was marked not by a grand gesture, but by a simple act. He stopped at the edge of his property, where the last fence post stood like a weathered gravestone. He dismounted, took a deep breath of the dry, dusty air that he had cursed for so long, and then he let the reins of his horse and the lead of the pack mule fall from his hands. He gave the horse a final pat on the neck. "Go on," he said, his voice rough. The animals, freed from his command, hesitated for a moment, then lowered their heads to graze on the sparse patches of grass. They would be found. They would be cared for. They were part of a world he was no longer in. He shouldered his pack, which contained only the most essential items, a knife, a flint and steel, a small amount of salted meat, and a water skin. The rest of his carefully purchased supplies he would have to carry in his arms. He took the 2 axes, the heavy pot, the roll of canvas, and began to walk. The weight was immense, a physical manifestation of the new life he was choosing. Every step was a struggle, a deliberate, painful assertion of his will. The open plains, the land that had defined him, fell away behind him. He entered the shadow of the foothills, the ground growing steeper, the air cooler. The scent of dust and dying grass was replaced by the sharp, clean smell of pine and damp earth. This was the true border. Not a line on a map or a fence in the ground, but a change in the very character of the world. The sun, which had been a relentless tyrant on the plains, was now a dappled, gentle presence, filtering through the canopy of the trees. The silence was different here, too. It was not the empty, ringing silence of the prairie, but a living silence, filled with the rustle of unseen things, the creak of branches, the distant call of a bird. He walked for hours, his muscles screaming, his lungs burning. He did not think about where he was going, not in a specific sense. He was following an instinct, a pull toward the deep, secret places of the earth. He was looking for a place that the world had forgotten, a place where he could be forgotten in turn. He made his first camp by a small, clear stream that tumbled down from the higher peaks. He drank deeply, the cold water a shock to his system. He did not build a fire. He did not want to announce his presence. He ate a small piece of his salted meat and wrapped himself in his wool blanket, the hard ground his new bed. Sleep did not come easily. The forest was alive with sounds, and his body was a symphony of aches. But as he lay there, looking up at the slivers of starlight visible through the dense web of branches, a profound sense of peace began to settle over him. There was no debt here. No drought. No Sterling. There was only the cold, the dark, and the honest, uncompromising reality of the wilderness. Here, the rules were simple. Live or die. And for the first time in a very long time, Abram Hale felt like he had a choice in the matter. The journey inward was a peeling away of layers. The man who had been a rancher, a husband, a neighbor, was sloughed off with every mile he covered, with every ridge he crested. He became a creature of pure function, his thoughts narrowed to the immediate necessities, water, shelter, the careful placement of his next footstep. He moved deeper into the Blackstones, into a wilderness that grew more primal and unforgiving. The trees were older here, their trunks thick as pillars, their canopy so dense that the forest floor lived in a perpetual twilight. He followed the game trails, the faint paths worn by deer and elk, letting the instinct of the animals guide him toward water and away from impassable terrain. For days, he searched. He was not looking for a place to camp, he was looking for a place to anchor the rest of his life. It had to be defensible, not from men, but from the crushing inevitability of winter. It had to have water, wood, and stone. It had to be a secret. He found it on the fourth day. A sheer wall of granite rose from a narrow, pine-choked valley, and halfway up its face was a dark opening, a horizontal slash in the rock. It was less a cave and more a deep, natural shelter, a vast overhang that promised protection from snow and rain. The approach was difficult, a steep scramble over loose scree and fallen logs, a natural defense that would deter any casual wanderer. He dropped his heavy burdens at the base of the cliff and climbed, his hands finding purchase on the rough, weathered stone. The air grew cooler as he neared the opening. He pulled himself over the final ledge and stood inside. The space was immense, larger than he had imagined. The rock ceiling arched high above him, and the floor, a mix of sand and packed earth, stretched back into the darkness. It was dry, protected, a natural fortress. From the mouth of the shelter he could see the entire valley laid out below him, a private kingdom of green and grey. He had found it. The place where he would make his stand. The work began immediately, a relentless, all-consuming labor that left no room for memory or regret. His first task was wood. He chose his trees with a woodsman's eye, selecting straight, dead-standing pines that would be easier to fell and already seasoned. The rhythmic thud of his axe became the new heartbeat of the valley. It was a sound of creation, not destruction. He was not clearing land for pasture, he was gathering the bones for his new home. He worked from first light until the last rays of the sun faded from the highest peaks, his body, softened by years of worry, slowly hardening into a new form. His hands, which had grown accustomed to the feel of worn leather reins, were now calloused and raw from the rough bark of the logs and the unyielding haft of the axe. He dragged the logs one by one up the steep incline to his shelter, a Herculean task that left him breathless and trembling with exhaustion. But every log that he added to the growing pile was a victory, a tangible piece of his new reality. He was not waiting for rain. He was not waiting for a banker's letter. He was building. He was creating shelter with the strength of his own body, and the simple, profound satisfaction of it was something he had not felt in years. It was a pain that was clean, honest, and earned. The construction of the cabin was an act of communion between man, wood, and stone. Abram worked with a patience born of necessity, for a mistake made alone in the wilderness could be fatal. He had no one to help him lift a log, no one to offer advice. He had only his own ingenuity and the unyielding laws of physics. He laid the foundation first, a rectangle of flat stones he levered out of the earth and dragged into place. This would keep the bottom logs from the dampness of the cave floor, preventing rot. Then came the walls. He spent a full week just notching the logs, using his sharpest axe to carve the half-moon cuts that would allow them to lock together at the corners. Each notch was a slow, careful process of shaving away the wood, testing the fit, and shaving again. His movements became fluid, repetitive, a meditation in wood and steel. The silence of the valley was his only companion, broken by the scrape of his axe and the soft thud of wood chips falling to the ground. He raised the walls one log at a time, a monumental struggle of leverage and balance. He used a smaller log as a ramp, slowly, painstakingly rolling the massive timbers up and into place. Sweat poured from him, stinging his eyes, and his muscles burned with an intensity that bordered on pain, but he did not stop. Each log that settled into its notches was a line in the story of his survival, a testament to his refusal to be erased. He built the chimney next, a task that required a different kind of skill. He gathered stones from the scree slope, choosing them for their shape and size, fitting them together like pieces of a complex puzzle. He made his own mortar from clay he dug from a stream bank and mixed with dry grass for binding. The work was slow, methodical, a counterpoint to the raw strength required for the logs. It was a work of precision, of finding the perfect balance and fit. As the chimney rose, it gave the structure a heart, a center around which a life could be lived. The roof was the final, crucial piece. He laid smaller logs across the top of the walls, then covered them with a thick layer of pine boughs to shed the rain. Over this, he stretched the heavy canvas he had bought from hemlocks, securing it with stones. It was not a perfect roof, but it would be a dry one. He left an opening in the back wall, a small square that would serve as a window, though it had no covering. It looked out into the deep, dark recesses of the cave, a portal into the ancient stone that now formed the back wall of his home. When he was finished, he stepped back and looked at what he had made. It was small, no bigger than the first room he and his wife had lived in. It was rough, bearing the marks of his tools and his struggle. But it was his. It had not been bought, or inherited, or mortgaged. It had been raised from the earth by the sweat of his brow and the force of his will. It was more than a shelter. It was a declaration. With the cabin built, the rhythm of Abram's life shifted. The frantic, desperate energy of construction gave way to the steady, cyclical pulse of sustenance. His existence became a series of fundamental, interconnected tasks, each one essential for his survival through the coming winter. His days were now governed by the sun and the seasons, not by the clock or the calendar. He rose with the first light, his senses immediately attuned to the world around him. He would stand at the mouth of his cave and read the morning, the direction of the wind, the feel of the air, the sounds of the forest waking up. These were the only headlines that mattered now. His primary concern was food. He set his snares along the game trails, his fingers growing deft at tying the intricate knots, at choosing the perfect location where a rabbit or a grouse might pass. He checked them every morning, his heart beating a little faster with anticipation. A successful snare meant another day of life, another small victory against the encroaching emptiness. He learned to hunt with a new kind of quietness, a deep, predatory patience. He had his old rifle, but ammunition was finite, a non-renewable resource. Each shot had to be a certainty. He spent more time watching than hunting, learning the habits of the deer that moved through the valley, their patterns of grazing, the times they came to the creek to drink. He was no longer a rancher, a steward of domesticated beasts. He was a predator, a part of the food chain, subject to its brutal, honest calculus. When he did make a kill, it was a solemn affair. Nothing was wasted. He would butcher the animal with a practiced efficiency, the meat sliced into thin strips to be smoked and dried over a low, smoldering fire. The hide would be scraped clean, stretched, and treated with tannins from oak bark, a long, laborious process that would yield the leather and fur he needed for warmth. The bones would be boiled down for broth, the fat rendered into tallow for candles. His world was a closed loop of resources, a constant process of transformation. He foraged for edible roots and late-season berries, his knowledge of the forest growing with each passing day. He learned which mushrooms were safe, which leaves could be used for tea, which barks had medicinal properties. The forest, which had once been a backdrop to his life, was now his larder, his pharmacy, his home. In the evenings, he would sit by his small fire, the flames pushing back the immense darkness of the cave. He would eat his simple meal of dried meat and roasted roots, the silence broken only by the crackle of the fire and the distant howl of a wolf. He was lonely, but it was a clean, sharp loneliness, utterly different from the corrosive isolation he had felt in his final months on the ranch, surrounded by people who could not understand his plight. Here, his solitude was a choice. It was a shield. It was, in its own way, a kind of freedom. The first snow came not as a gentle dusting but as a sudden, silent onslaught, a white curtain dropping over the valley and sealing it off from the rest of the world. Abram woke one morning to a profound and absolute silence, a muffling of all sound that was both peaceful and deeply unnerving. He looked out from his shelter to see a world transformed, the familiar greens and greys of the forest buried under a thick, immaculate blanket of white. Winter had arrived. This was the test he had been preparing for, the adversary against which all his labors had been measured. The cold was a physical presence, a thing that seeped through the chinking of his cabin and settled deep in his bones. His life contracted, shrinking to the small circle of warmth thrown by his stone fireplace. The days grew short, the nights impossibly long. Time itself seemed to slow down, stretching and thinning like spun glass. For weeks on end, he did not leave the shelter, imprisoned by the deep snow and the brutal, wind-driven cold. The world outside his door was a beautiful, lethal abstraction. He lived off his stores, the fruits of his autumn labors. The smoked meat, the dried roots, The carefully stacked firewood, each was a testament to his foresight, a bulwark against the killing frost. His days fell into a simple, monastic routine. He would wake, tend the fire, eat a small meal, and then spend the hours maintaining his tools, mending his clothes, or simply sitting in the quiet, watching the slow dance of the flames. In this enforced stillness, the past, which he had held at bay through sheer physical exertion, returned. Memories came to him unbidden in the long, dark hours. He saw his wife's face, not as she was at the end, frail and feverish, but as she had been when they first came to this land, her eyes bright with a hope he had long since forgotten. He remembered the feel of her hand in his, the sound of her laughter as they watched the sun set over their small herd. These memories were no longer sharp with the pain of loss. The edges had been worn smooth by time and solitude. They were just pictures now, moments from a life that felt as if it had belonged to someone else. He did not fight them. He let them come, acknowledging them with a quiet sadness that was no longer overwhelming. He had lived that life, and it was over. He was living this life now. One evening, a blizzard descended on the valley, a howling fury of wind and snow that shook the very stones of the mountain. The wind shrieked through the pines, a sound of pure, elemental rage. Inside his small cabin, Abram sat by the fire, feeding it logs, his only companion in the storm. He was a tiny, insignificant speck of warmth and life in the face of an immense, indifferent power. He was completely, utterly alone. And yet, he felt no fear. He had built this shelter. He had cut this wood. He was warm, he was dry, and he was alive. He had met the world on its own terms and had, for now, survived. In the heart of the storm, in the deepest solitude he had ever known, Abram Hale found a kind of peace. Back in the present, Sheriff Tate found the journal. It was tucked away on a small shelf carved into the rock, a simple ledger book with a worn leather cover. He sat on the edge of the cot, the tanned hides cool beneath him, and opened it. The first entry was dated the day after Abram had walked away from his ranch. The handwriting was tight, controlled, the words sparse and practical. Began walking west. Heavy load. Made camp by the creek. The early pages were a log of his labor, felled 6 pines today. Hands are raw. Dragged them to the shelter. This will be the place. There were no outpourings of emotion, no lamentations for his lost life. It was the simple, factual accounting of a man focused entirely on the task at hand. Tate could feel the immense effort behind the spare prose, the sheer, dogged determination it took to accomplish what he had. Finn stood by the unlit fireplace, running a hand over the cool, masterfully laid stones. He was a better mason than my uncle, he said, his voice filled with a quiet respect. And he was a rancher. Tate didn't answer. He kept reading, turning the pages, watching the seasons change through Abram's brief, daily entries. He read about the first successful hunt, the challenges of preserving the meat, the constant, gnawing worry about the coming winter. Then, the entries shifted. The relentless focus on survival began to be interspersed with observations. Saw a bald eagle today. It flew the length of the valley without a single flap of its wings. Another entry read, "The silence is the loudest thing here." It has a weight. Tate could feel Abram changing on the page, the hardened survivor slowly giving way to a quiet philosopher. The man who had been stripped of everything was rediscovering the world in its most elemental form. He was no longer fighting it. He was becoming a part of it. The final entries were from the depths of winter. The handwriting grew a little shakier, the ink paler. The snow is 8 feet deep. Have not seen the ground in a month. The wood holds. The meat holds. I hold. The Tate read the last entry, dated nearly 7 months ago, in the dead of winter. The fire is warm. The wind is singing its old song. I believe this is what peace feels like. I will sleep now. Tate closed the book. The story was complete. He knew now what he would find. He walked toward the bed, his movement slow, reverent. Abram was there, lying under the heavy hide blankets, his body preserved by the dry, cold air of the cave. He looked thin, but not starved. His face was peaceful, the lines of worry and grief smoothed away. He looked like a man who had simply laid down for a nap and had not woken up. He had not died in a blizzard, or from starvation, or from an animal attack. He had made it through the worst of the winter. He had won. And then, his heart, having carried him through it all, had simply given out. He had died in his own bed, in the home he had built, a king in a kingdom of stone and pine. Finn came to stand beside him, his hat held respectfully in his hands. He looked from Abram's peaceful face to the meticulously ordered cabin. "What do we do, Sheriff?" he asked softly. It was a question with more than one meaning. "What do we do with the body? What do we do with this place? What do we do with this story?" Tate looked around the shelter, at the stacked firewood, the hanging jerky, the tools resting neatly against the wall. This was not the scene of a tragedy. It was the final chapter of a life lived on its own terms, a life reclaimed from the quiet violence of foreclosure and progress. To report this would be to desecrate it. Men from the bank would come, Sterling's men, bureaucrats. They would label him a squatter, an eccentric, a failure who had run off to die in the woods. They would dismantle the cabin, sell off the tools, and erase this small, defiant pocket of existence from the map. They would take his story and twist it into something ugly, something that served their own narrative of order and ownership. Tate thought of the world back in Redemption, a world of deeds and debts, of winners and losers. Abram had refused to be a loser. He had simply quit the game and created his own. Here, in this hidden valley, he had been more of a man than he ever could have been on his failing ranch. He had found a different kind of wealth, a different kind of success. "We do nothing," Tate said, his voice firm. Finn looked at him, surprised. "So? He's not hurting anyone here," Tate continued, looking back at Abram. "This place. This is his monument. We leave it as it is." He picked up the journal from the bed. "We take this. And we report that we found no sign of him." As far as the world is concerned, Abram Hale just kept on walking. A look of understanding, and then profound respect, dawned on Finn's face. He nodded slowly. "Yes, sir." They made their way out of the shelter, stepping from the cool, still air of the cave back into the warm afternoon sun. Tate paused at the ledge and looked back one last time. He saw not a hermit's hovel, but a fortress of the human spirit. A place built not just of wood and stone, but of sheer, unyielding will. He would keep the journal, a private testament to a man who had faced the end of his world and had chosen not to surrender, but to build a new one, a world of his own making, hidden away in the heart of the mountains. The story of Abram Hale was over, but it would not be the one the world told. It would be the one that remained here, written in the silent language of stone and wood, a quiet, enduring legacy of a man who had walked out of one life and into another, finding not an end, but a final, unassailable peace.